It all started innocently enough. At least that's what I told myself in the beginning. My wife, Emily, and I had been married for 10 years. We had a 7-year-old son, Dylan, who was the light of our lives. Like most couples with young children, our relationship had shifted over the years. The passion we had shared in our early days had given way to a more comfortable, routine partnership. We were solid, at least that's what I thought, until I met Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson, or Olivia, as I later came to know her, was Dylan's second-grade teacher. We first met during a parent-teacher conference. She was in her early 30s, with a kind face framed by shoulder-length chestnut hair. Her voice was calm and soothing, the kind that could quiet a room full of rambunctious kids, and yet there was a spark in her eyes, a hint of something mischievous and exciting. Emily couldn't make it to that first conference. She was swamped with a work deadline. So, I went alone, expecting a straightforward conversation about Dylan's progress in class. Olivia welcomed me into the brightly decorated classroom with a warm smile. As we sat across from each other at one of the small desks meant for the children, I couldn't help but notice how the gentle light from the window behind her brought out the subtle flecks of gold in her brown eyes. We talked about Dylan's progress. He was doing well academically but seemed a bit distracted lately. I asked Olivia if she thought there was anything we should be worried about. "Not at all," she said, flashing a reassuring smile. "He's a great kid, really. Sometimes children at this age just need a little extra motivation." Her tone was easygoing, and I found myself chatting with her longer than I had planned. We drifted away from the topic of Dylan and began discussing other things, her passion for teaching, my work, and our shared love of hiking. The conversation felt natural, as if I were catching up with an old friend. I didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to just being friendly. But as I left the classroom that day, I couldn't shake the image of her smile from my mind. The following weeks passed uneventfully. Emily and I settled back into our usual routine. We were both busy with work, and the most exciting part of our days often revolved around Dylan's activities or planning for the weekend. But I began noticing small details about Olivia whenever I saw her at school events or pickups. Her laugh, the way she would glance over at me and hold my gaze for just a second longer than necessary. It was subtle, but it made me wonder. I told myself I was being ridiculous. She was just being nice, and I was letting my imagination run wild. Still, I found excuses to arrive at school earlier, hoping to catch a glimpse of her in the hallway, or to exchange a few words if she happened to be supervising the kids before the bell rang. It was during one of those early mornings when our casual exchanges turned into something more. As I approached the school entrance, I noticed Olivia standing outside, chatting with another parent. She was wearing a light blue blouse that complemented her eyes, and as she noticed me approaching, she gave a small wave. "Hey, Mr. Edwards," she greeted with a teasing smile. "You're becoming quite the regular around here." I laughed, slightly embarrassed at being caught. "Well, what can I say? I'm just a dedicated dad. Or maybe you're just trying to avoid morning traffic," she teased, her eyes twinkling. The playful banter became a pattern over the next few weeks. It was harmless fun, or so I thought. But then one Friday afternoon, I got a text from her. It was unexpected. Olivia didn't usually text the parents unless it was something about school. "Hey Josh, it's Olivia. I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. I just wanted to let you know that Dylan left his water bottle in the classroom. I'll be here for another hour if you'd like to swing by and pick it up." There was nothing out of the ordinary in the message, yet as I read it, a strange thrill coursed through me. I told myself it was just the novelty of receiving a message from her and nothing more. I texted her back, letting her know I'd be there soon. When I arrived at the classroom, the school hallways were eerily quiet, the sounds of children's chatter and footsteps replaced by the low hum of the air conditioning. Olivia was inside, sorting some papers at her desk. She looked up when I entered, and a slow smile spread across her face. "Hey Josh," she said, standing up. "You made it." "Yeah. Thanks for letting me know about the water bottle," I replied, my voice coming out a little too casual. As I stepped closer, she handed me the water bottle, our fingers brushing slightly. It was an innocent touch, but it lingered in the air between us. There was a moment, An unmistakable moment, where we both just stood there, as if caught in the anticipation of what could happen next. "So," she began, her voice softer now, "how's everything going?" "Good. Busy. You know how it is?" I replied, feeling an odd mix of guilt and exhilaration just from being there with her alone. "I get it," she said, leaning against the edge of her desk. "Sometimes it feels like the weeks just blur together." "Yeah," I agreed, my gaze drifting to the curve of her lips. "Sometimes it does." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged with an energy I hadn't felt in a long time. For a split second, I almost forgot I was a married man standing in my son's classroom, talking to his teacher. The moment felt surreal, as though I had crossed an invisible line without fully realizing it. "I should probably get going," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Of course," Olivia replied, her expression neutral, but there was something in her eyes that hinted at more. As I turned to leave, I felt a strange sensation of longing, a feeling I hadn't expected. I hadn't done anything wrong, and yet, I couldn't deny that something had shifted. I knew I should have walked away right then, put this all behind me. But as the weekend approached, I found myself thinking about Olivia more and more. Little did I know that Friday afternoon would be the beginning of something that would change everything I thought I knew about myself, my marriage, and what I was willing to risk for the thrill of the unknown. The next week was a blur. I tried to push thoughts of Olivia out of my mind, reminding myself that it was harmless, that nothing had actually happened. But there was a persistent, nagging feeling that wouldn't go away. I found myself glancing at my phone more often, half hoping for another message from her, though I knew it would be completely inappropriate. When none came, I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment that I wasn't entirely proud of. Emily and I went about our usual routines, and nothing seemed amiss between us. But I started to notice small things that hadn't bothered me before. Her preoccupation with work, the way our conversations had become more about logistics than about us. It wasn't that I didn't love her. I did. It was just different, familiar in a way that felt comfortable but not necessarily exciting. And that was when I realized just how much I was craving excitement. The following Wednesday, as I dropped Dylan off at school, I spotted Olivia in the hallway again. She was talking with a group of students, her laughter ringing out above the chatter. As she caught sight of me, her smile lingered a moment longer, and I felt my pulse quicken. It was then that I realized how much I had been looking forward to seeing her, even if just for a few seconds. "Morning, Mr. Edwards," she called out playfully. "Still beating the morning rush, I see." I chuckled and walked over, feeling a little bit like a schoolboy with a crush. What can I say? I like being early. There was a look in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. It was more than friendliness, it felt like an invitation, though I wasn't sure what exactly was being offered. The exchange was brief, but it lingered in my thoughts long after I left. That night, after Emily and Dylan had gone to bed, I found myself scrolling through my phone, my thumb hesitating over Olivia's contact. There was no reason for me to text her, no excuse that wouldn't seem forced or suspicious. But the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to feel that same thrill I had experienced in the classroom. So, against my better judgment, I sent her a message. "Hey, just wanted to say thanks again for letting me know about Dylan's water bottle last week. Appreciate it." The message was vague enough to seem casual, but I knew exactly why I was sending it. I put the phone down, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation as I waited for a reply. Came about an hour later. "No problem at all, Josh. Happy to help. How's Dylan doing?" The conversation was innocent, at least on the surface. We chatted about Dylan for a bit, but then the topic drifted toward more personal matters, our hobbies, weekend plans, and eventually our lives outside of school. It was during these late-night exchanges that we began to cross that invisible line, though it wasn't always obvious. The messages became more frequent, and soon enough, there were small hints of flirtation. Her compliments, though subtle, were always well-placed, and I found myself returning them with equal enthusiasm. Our conversations started to feel like something we were both keeping secret, though nothing overtly inappropriate had been said. Yet, the next few weeks followed a similar pattern. The brief moments at school, the late-night texts, the shared laughter over jokes that were just between the two of us. It all built up to something unspoken. I knew I was treading dangerous waters, but I couldn't stop myself. Felt too good, too exhilarating to resist. And then one Friday evening, when Emily and Dylan were out at a friend's birthday party, Olivia texted me, "Hey Josh, I'm at this little coffee shop near the school grading papers. If you're not busy, want to join me for a quick coffee?" I stared at the screen, knowing full well what this meant. It was one thing to share playful messages, but meeting up outside of school was a different step entirely. Still, before I could overthink it, I found myself typing back, "Sure, sounds good. I'll be there in 20. As I pulled up to the coffee shop, a quaint little place with dim lighting and a cozy atmosphere, I felt a knot of tension in my stomach. I spotted Olivia sitting by the window, her face softly illuminated by the light from outside. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes widening just slightly in acknowledgement. "Hey!" she greeted, a smile spreading across her face. "Glad you could make it." "Of course," I replied, trying to sound casual even though my heart was racing. I needed an excuse to get out of the house. She laughed softly, gesturing to the seat across from her. As I sat down, I could feel the air between us thicken, the tension growing. We talked for a while about the usual things, work, life, Dylan, but there was an undeniable charge to the conversation, like we were both waiting for something to happen. It wasn't until the coffee shop began to empty out that Olivia leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You know, I've really enjoyed our chats," she said, her eyes holding mine. "It's nice to have someone to talk to." "Yeah, me too," I replied, feeling the weight of those words. It's been a while since I felt this kind of connection. There it was, an admission. I wasn't even sure what exactly I was admitting, but it was enough to push us past the point of no return. She glanced at me with a look that seemed to dare me to take the next step. I reached across the table, my hand brushing against hers, and for a moment we just sat there like that, caught in the electricity of that simple touch. When she didn't pull away, I knew I was in deeper than I had intended. "Maybe we should get out of here," she suggested, her voice barely audible. Without thinking, I nodded. "Yeah, let's go." As we walked out of the coffee shop together, I felt a rush of adrenaline mixed with guilt. This wasn't just a coffee anymore. It was the beginning of something I wasn't sure I could control, something that had the power to destroy the life I had built with Emily. But at that moment, the thrill outweighed the fear, and as we got into our separate cars, I followed her to a place where we could be alone. We ended up at a quiet park on the edge of town, far enough away from anyone who might recognize us. It was the kind of place where teenagers went to sneak drinks or couples met for secret rendezvous, discreet and dimly lit by the occasional street lamp. Olivia parked her car a short distance from mine, and I could feel my hands shaking slightly as I stepped out. This was a moment that could change everything, and I was terrified and excited all at once. Olivia got out of her car and walked over to where I was standing. Her eyes were wide, glinting with a mixture of uncertainty and anticipation. We stood there for a moment, neither of us saying a word. It felt like time had frozen, and yet everything was rushing forward too quickly. "Josh, she began, but before she could finish, I reached for her hand. The touch was gentle, hesitant even, as though I was giving her a final chance to back out. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she took a step closer, her breath warm against my neck. The space between us closed, and suddenly, her lips were on mine. The kiss was tentative at first, as if we were testing the boundaries, but it quickly deepened. Her arms wrapped around my neck, and I pulled her closer, feeling the warmth of her body pressed against mine. There was an urgency in the way we kissed, like we were both desperate to escape the realities of our lives, even if just for a moment. When we finally broke apart, I was breathing heavily. I could see the same struggle mirrored in her eyes, the thrill of the kiss clashing with the guilt of what it meant. We had crossed a line, and there was no way to undo it. "Maybe we shouldn't have done that," she whispered, but her hands were still resting on my chest, her fingers clutching my shirt as if she didn't want to let go. "I know," I replied, though the words felt hollow. But I don't regret it. Her gaze softened, and she gave me a small, sad smile. Neither do I. For a while, we just stood there, wrapped up in each other, savoring the stolen moment. Then, reluctantly, we broke apart. She suggested we take a walk, and I agreed, needing a distraction from the weight of what we had just done. We strolled along a winding path through the park, keeping close enough for our shoulders to brush occasionally. The cool night air helped to clear my head, but it didn't make the situation any easier to rationalize. As we walked, we talked more openly than we ever had before. We shared details about our lives that went beyond the surface. Our frustrations, our fears, our disappointments. It felt freeing to be so honest with someone who wasn't part of my everyday world. I know this is wrong, Olivia said after a long pause, her voice quiet and reflective. But sometimes, I feel like I'm just going through the motions. Teaching is the only thing that makes me feel alive anymore. I understood what she meant more than I cared to admit. I get it, I replied, sighing. Lately, it feels like I'm just existing. Emily and I were fine, but it's like we've lost something along the way. I didn't realize how much I missed feeling this kind of excitement. She glanced up at me, her expression filled with a mixture of empathy and longing. I don't know where this is going, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But I don't want to stop. The confession hung in the air, heavy with implications. I reached out and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. I don't either, I admitted, and with that, a silent agreement was made between us. We would continue, despite knowing how reckless it was, because the pull we felt toward each other was stronger than our guilt. After that night, our connection deepened. What had started as a series of flirty texts and secret meetings at coffee shops quickly escalated. We began meeting whenever we could, even if just for a few minutes between classes or a brief touch of hands when no one was looking. The secrecy of it all only added to the allure. It was dangerous, and yet, I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. One afternoon, Olivia and I arranged to meet at a small bed and breakfast outside of town. I had told Emily that I needed to work late, and as I drove there, I felt a knot of guilt twist in my stomach. This was no longer just an innocent connection. It was a full-blown affair. But by now, I was too far in to turn back. When I arrived, Olivia was already there, waiting for me in one of the rooms. The moment I saw her, any hesitation I had disappeared. She looked at me with a mixture of relief and desire, and I closed the distance between us in an instant, pulling her into my arms. The world outside that room ceased to exist. There were no consequences, no responsibilities. Just the two of us, lost in the heat of the moment. We spent hours there, talking and touching, sharing the kind of intimacy that went beyond physical. It was more than just an escape. It felt like something real, something that had been missing from my life for a long time. But as the afternoon faded into evening, reality crept back in. We couldn't stay there forever. I wish we didn't have to leave, Olivia murmured as she lay beside me, her head resting on my shoulder. Me too, I replied, stroking her hair gently. But we both know this can't last. She lifted her head and looked at me, her expression conflicted. What do we do now, Josh? The question hung in the air, and I didn't have an answer. I couldn't imagine ending things with her, but I also couldn't imagine tearing apart my family for the sake of an affair. The reality of our situation hit me hard as I drove home that night. The guilt I had managed to push aside was now impossible to ignore. I thought about Emily and Dylan, about the life I had built and the people I was putting at risk. But then I thought about Olivia, how alive I felt when I was with her, how much I craved that feeling. The affair continued, though we became more cautious. We arranged our meetings with the utmost care, always finding excuses and covering our tracks. But no matter how careful we were, there were signs that things weren't as they should be. Emily started to notice that I was distracted, that I was spending more time at work or on my phone. She didn't say anything at first, but I could see the suspicion growing in her eyes. One evening, as we were sitting on the couch watching TV, she turned to me and asked, "Is everything okay, Josh? You seem distant lately." Her question caught me off guard, and I fumbled for a response. Yeah, I'm fine. Just a lot going on at work, you know how it is. She nodded slowly, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. If there's something wrong, you'd tell me, right? Of course, I said, forcing a smile. There's nothing to worry about. But as the days went on, I began to feel the walls closing in. I knew I couldn't keep up this double life forever, and sooner or later, something would have to give. The only question was what, or rather, who I was willing to lose. As the affair continued, I tried my best to compartmentalize my life, keeping my time with Olivia and my home life with Emily and Dylan completely separate. But as much as I tried to maintain the illusion that everything was under control, the cracks were beginning to show. My late nights and frequent absences hadn't gone unnoticed, and Emily was growing increasingly suspicious. One Saturday, Emily suggested we take a family day trip to the beach. It was a spontaneous idea, the kind of thing we used to do all the time before my life had become so complicated. As we packed up the car, I felt a pang of guilt. Here was my wife, trying to reconnect, to bring us closer as a family, while I was tangled in a web of lies with another woman. The day started off fine. The weather was perfect, and Dylan was thrilled to play in the sand and splash in the waves. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going through the motions. Emily seemed to sense my distraction, and at one point, while Dylan was busy building a sandcastle, she turned to me and asked, "Are you happy, Josh? I mean, really happy?" Her question took me by surprise, and I struggled to come up with an answer that didn't sound forced. "Of course I'm happy," I replied, my tone betraying the doubt I was trying to suppress. "Why wouldn't I be?" Emily's eyes searched my face, and I could tell she wasn't satisfied with my response. "I don't know. It just feels like you've been somewhere else lately. Like your mind is always a million miles away." I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything was fine, but I couldn't bring myself to lie to her face like that. "I'm just stressed," I said finally, trying to inject some honesty into my voice. "Work's been overwhelming lately, and I guess I haven't been great about leaving it at the office." She nodded slowly, but I could see the worry etched on her features. I miss you, Josh," she said quietly. "I feel like we're not as close as we used to be." Her words hit me hard, and for a moment, I considered telling her everything. But the thought of confessing, of shattering our family's life, was too terrifying to even entertain. So instead, I pulled her into a hug and whispered, "I'm still here, Em. I promise." But as I held her, I felt a hollow ache in my chest because I knew that promise was becoming harder and harder to keep. The affair with Olivia continued to intensify. We were meeting almost every week now, sneaking away to hotels and hidden spots outside of town where we wouldn't be recognized. The secrecy and the danger made it all the more exhilarating, but it also meant that the lies were piling up. It felt like I was living two separate lives, and I was constantly on edge, waiting for the moment when it would all come crashing down. Things came to a head one afternoon when Emily called me unexpectedly while I was with Olivia. We had been lying in bed, tangled up in each other, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I saw Emily's name on the screen and felt a jolt of panic shoot through me. "I should take this," I said, quickly disentangling myself and grabbing the phone. Olivia nodded, a flicker of concern crossing her face. I stepped out into the hallway, taking a deep breath before answering. "Hey, Em. What's up?" "Hey." Emily's voice came through, sounding casual, but I could detect an undercurrent of uncertainty. "I was just checking in to see if you were still at work. I tried calling your office line, but you didn't pick up." My heart raced. I hadn't expected her to try my work line, and I was scrambling for a plausible excuse. "Yeah, I stepped out for a bit," I lied, forcing a calm tone. "Had to run a quick errand." "Oh, okay," she said, sounding relieved. "I was just going to ask if you could pick up some groceries on your way home. I've been swamped here, and I could use the help." "Of course," I replied, thankful for the mundane nature of the request. "I'll take care of it. See you at home." After I hung up, I leaned against the wall, feeling a wave of shame wash over me. I had just lied to my wife, straight to her face. When I walked back into the room, Olivia was sitting up in bed, her expression cautious. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Yeah, it's fine," I replied, but I could hear the tension in my own voice. It was just Emily. The mention of her name seemed to shift the atmosphere in the room. Olivia's smile faded slightly, and I could see the weight of our situation settling over her. "Josh, are you sure about all this?" she asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "I don't want to come between you and your family." Her words were like a slap in the face, forcing me to confront the reality of what we were doing. "I don't know," I admitted, running a hand through my hair in frustration. "I care about you, Olivia, more than I probably should. But I also don't want to hurt Emily or Dylan." She nodded, her gaze dropping to the bedspread. "I get it," she whispered. "I never meant for this to go this far." Neither of us knew what to say after that. We dressed in silence, the weight of our choices hanging over us like a dark cloud. I kissed her goodbye, but the kiss felt different this time, tinged with an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere between Olivia and me grew strained. We still met, but there was a hesitancy in our interactions now. It was as if the reality of our situation had finally caught up with us, and we were both struggling to figure out where to go from here. The guilt weighed heavily on me, and for the first time, I began to seriously consider ending the affair. But just when I thought I was ready to walk away, Olivia dropped a bombshell that turned my world upside down. It was a late Tuesday evening when she texted me, asking if we could meet. Her message had a tone of urgency that made my stomach twist with anxiety. We met at the same park where we had shared our first kiss, and as I approached, I could see the worry etched on her face. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice unsteady. Olivia looked at me, her eyes wide and fearful. "Josh, I'm late," she said quietly, the words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. "I think I might be pregnant." The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, and I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. "What?" I breathed, unable to process the enormity of what she was saying. "I'm not sure yet," she continued quickly, her voice trembling. "But I missed my period, and I don't know what to do." A cold dread washed over me as I stood there, trying to make sense of the situation. This was the one thing I hadn't prepared for, the one possibility that could bring everything crashing down in an instant. If Olivia was pregnant, there would be no hiding the affair, no keeping this secret buried. It would destroy my marriage, my family, everything. "We need to find out for sure," I said finally, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. "You need to take a test." She nodded, looking small and scared. "I know," she whispered. I didn't want to do it alone." The fear in her eyes broke something inside me, and I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly. "You're not alone," I murmured, even though I had no idea how I was going to handle this. "We'll figure it out. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." But as I held her there in the darkened park, the gravity of the situation began to sink in, and I knew that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The next day felt like a blur. I could hardly focus on work, and every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped, thinking it might be Olivia with news. She had agreed to take a pregnancy test that evening, and the hours leading up to it seemed to stretch on forever. The weight of the potential consequences pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. When I arrived home that night, I found Emily sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. She glanced up and gave me a tired smile, and I couldn't help but notice the lines of worry etched around her eyes. It hit me just how much I had been neglecting her, how distracted I had been over the past few months. Guilt gnawed at me, knowing that I had dragged her into this unknowingly. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, looking up from her screen. "You seem tense." "Yeah, just a long day," I replied, forcing a smile and trying to sound normal. "Work's been a nightmare lately." She nodded, accepting my explanation without question, and I hated myself a little more for lying to her so effortlessly. I wished I could reach out to her, confide in her the way I used to when something was troubling me. But that door had been closed the moment I crossed the line with Olivia. Later that night, when Emily had gone to bed, I received the message I had been dreading all day. Josh, I took the test. Can we talk? My stomach twisted into knots as I read the words. I texted back immediately, asking her to call. Moments later, the phone rang, and I answered on the first ring. Olivia, I said, my voice barely steady. What did the test say? She took a deep breath, and then the words came tumbling out. It was positive, Josh. I'm pregnant. The world seemed to tilt, and I gripped the edge of the counter for support. I had feared this outcome, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. I couldn't process what this meant for either of us. Are you sure? I asked, knowing full well how absurd the question sounded even as it left my lips. Yes, I'm sure, she replied, her voice breaking. I took 2 tests. They both said the same thing. There was a long, heavy silence as I tried to absorb the reality of the situation. Okay, I said finally, though I had no idea what to say next. We'll figure this out. Josh, what are we going to do? She asked, her voice tinged with panic. I don't want to blow up your life. I don't want to destroy your family. I swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. I don't know, I admitted, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over me. We need time to think, to decide what to do. For the next week, Olivia and I spoke frequently, trying to work through our options. The secrecy of our affair had turned into a shared burden, one that weighed heavily on both of us. She was scared, and I was terrified, not only for her, but for what this could mean for my marriage. Meanwhile, Emily continued to notice that I was distracted, and I could tell she was growing more suspicious with each passing day. She would catch me staring off into space, or she'd try to initiate conversations and I would give one-word answers, too preoccupied with the crisis unfolding outside of our home. One night, Emily confronted me. We were lying in bed, and she turned to face me, her expression filled with a mixture of concern and frustration. Josh, something's going on, she said, her voice tense. I don't know what it is, but you've been distant for months. Please just tell me the truth. Is there someone else? The question landed like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words caught in my throat. I had lied so many times already that I didn't think I could bring myself to add another one to the pile. My hesitation must have been enough, because Emily's eyes widened, and she sat up, her voice trembling. Oh my God! There is someone else, isn't there? She whispered, the hurt evident in her voice. Emily, it's not. I began, but she cut me off, anger rising to the surface. Don't lie to me, she snapped, her voice breaking. I can see it in your eyes. I've known something was wrong for a long time, but I didn't want to believe it. Who is she? The room felt like it was spinning, and I struggled to find the right words. Emily, please, I never meant for this to happen, I said, my voice cracking. It was a mistake. I'm so sorry. Her face crumpled as the weight of my confession sank in. She buried her face in her hands, and I could hear her sobbing. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but she recoiled, her voice filled with a mix of anguish and fury. How long? She asked, her words coming out in a harsh whisper. How long has this been going on? About 6 months, I admitted, my own voice barely audible. But it doesn't change how I feel about you or our family. I made a terrible mistake. A mistake? She spat, her eyes blazing with hurt. 6 months is not a mistake, Josh. It's a choice you made over and over again. I had no argument, no justification that could possibly make this any better. I watched helplessly as she stood up from the bed and stormed out of the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the house, a stark reminder of the damage I had done. The days that followed were unbearable. Emily wouldn't speak to me unless it was absolutely necessary, and even then, her voice was cold and distant. I knew I had shattered the trust between us, and I didn't know if there was any way to repair it. Meanwhile, Olivia was struggling as well. She felt immense guilt over being the other woman, and worried constantly about the future. We talked about the pregnancy, but the conversations were always heavy with uncertainty. Olivia told me she didn't want to keep the baby if it meant breaking up my family, but the thought of terminating the pregnancy was tearing her apart. Then, one evening, when the silence in the house had grown too thick, I approached Emily. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying. I took a deep breath and sat down across from her. "Emily, we need to talk," I said quietly. "About everything." She looked up at me, the pain in her eyes almost too much to bear. "You think talking is going to fix this?" she asked bitterly. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But I owe you the truth. All of it." And so, I told her everything. I confessed to the affair, to the time we had spent together, and finally, I told her about Olivia's pregnancy. It was the hardest conversation I'd ever had in my life. I watched as the woman I loved broke down in front of me, realizing just how much I had hurt her. When I finished, Emily stood up, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't even know who you are anymore, Josh," she said, her voice filled with devastation. "I can't look at you right now. I need you to leave." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks, and I nodded, knowing I had no right to argue. I packed a bag and left the house, the weight of my actions finally coming down on me like a tidal wave. As I drove away, the reality of my situation hit me in full force. I had lost my home, possibly my marriage, and I had no idea what kind of future I was heading toward. All I knew was that I had to face the consequences of my choices, no matter how painful they were. I found myself staying in a small, nondescript motel on the edge of town. The place was far from comfortable, but it was cheap and offered me some semblance of privacy. I spent most of my time staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying the events of the past few months in my mind, as if there was some detail I could change, some different decision I could have made that would have prevented my life from unraveling the way it had. But there was no escaping the truth. I had been the one to set all of this in motion. I reached out to Emily several times over the next few days, leaving voicemails and sending texts, but she didn't respond. I knew I had to give her space, but the silence was excruciating. I missed her more than I could put into words, missed the life we had shared. But I also knew that I had shattered the foundation of that life, and I had no right to expect her to just forgive me. Olivia was the only person I spoke to regularly during that time, and even our conversations were strained. She had decided to keep the baby. Despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to terminate the pregnancy, and I didn't try to push her in either direction. It was her choice to make, and as much as the thought of having a child outside of my marriage terrified me, I couldn't imagine forcing her to do something she wasn't ready to do. I don't know how I'm supposed to feel," Olivia admitted one evening over the phone. "Part of me is happy about the baby, but another part of me feels like it's all happening under the worst possible circumstances." "I understand," I said, though the truth was, I didn't fully understand. How could I? I wasn't the one carrying a child, the one facing the judgment of the world for being the other woman. All I knew was that I had to be there for her now, in whatever way I could. The guilt of what I had done weighed heavily on me, but I couldn't simply walk away from the mess I had created. I had responsibilities to Olivia now, and to the unborn child, even if it meant sacrificing what remained of my marriage. But I wasn't ready to give up on Emily yet, not completely. About a week after I left the house, I got a call from Emily. It was early in the morning, and I was jolted awake by the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. When I saw her name flash across the screen, my heart leapt with a mixture of hope and dread. "Emily," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I want to talk," she said, her tone neutral. "But not here. Can you meet me at the park? The one where we used to take Dylan when he was little." "Of course," I replied immediately. "I'll be there." The park was only a short drive from the motel, but the journey felt like it took forever. When I arrived, I spotted Emily sitting on a bench under a large oak tree, the same bench where we had spent so many afternoons watching Dylan play on the swings. As I approached, she looked up, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe sadness, maybe anger, maybe both. "Thanks for meeting me," I said quietly as I sat down next to her, leaving a careful distance between us. Emily didn't respond right away. She stared out at the empty playground, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. I don't even know where to start, Josh. Everything's just a mess. I know, I admitted, my throat tightening. I don't have any excuses for what I did. I betrayed you, and I'm so sorry. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Sorry doesn't change anything. Sorry doesn't erase what you did. You cheated, and now there's a baby involved. How am I supposed to move past that? I had no answer, so I just sat there, my heart aching as I watched tears well up in her eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me, I said softly. I don't even know if I can forgive myself, but I want to try to make things right, if there's any chance at all. Emily turned to look at me then, her gaze piercing. And what does making things right mean, Josh? Leaving Olivia and pretending like this never happened? You can't just walk away from a child. I know, I said, my voice cracking. I don't want to abandon my responsibilities to the baby or to Olivia. But I don't want to lose you either. I still love you, Emily. That hasn't changed. She looked away, her expression pained. How can you say you love me when you did this to us? She whispered. If you loved me, you wouldn't have been with her in the first place. I was selfish, I confessed, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I felt stuck, like I was just going through the motions. But that's no excuse. I should have talked to you about how I was feeling, instead of looking for an escape. An escape, she repeated bitterly. So, that's all she was to you? An escape. It's more complicated than that, I admitted, though I knew how awful it sounded. I do care about Olivia, and I know that hurts you to hear, but what I feel for her doesn't take away from what I feel for you. It's just different. Emily shook her head, her jaw clenched. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Josh. You've broken something that might not be fixable. Silence fell between us, and I could feel the weight of those words settling over me like a heavy fog. I knew she was right. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to repair. But I also knew I had to try. What do you want to do? I asked finally, my voice filled with desperation. I'll respect whatever decision you make. She didn't answer right away. She seemed to be weighing her thoughts, her face a mix of conflicting emotions. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but filled with sadness. I think we need time apart, Josh, she said. Real time apart, not just you staying at a motel. I need space to figure out what I want and what's best for Dylan. The finality in her tone left no room for argument, and I nodded, knowing that pushing her would only make things worse. Okay, I said quietly. I understand. As we parted ways, I felt a sense of loss deeper than anything I had ever experienced. The reality that I might have ruined my marriage for good began to sink in. Emily was right. I couldn't undo what I had done, and I had no one to blame but myself. The weeks passed in a blur of numbness. I threw myself into work, trying to keep busy, trying not to think about the mess my life had become. Emily filed for a separation, and we agreed to joint custody of Dylan for the time being. She was civil but distant, and our interactions were limited to discussing arrangements for Dylan. It was as if we had become strangers, our once shared life now divided into separate paths. As for Olivia, she continued with the pregnancy, and I did my best to support her, attending doctor's appointments and making plans for the future of our child. But things between us were strained as well. We were bound together by circumstance, not love, and that made our interactions feel forced. There was no more thrill, no more excitement, just the cold reality of what we had done and the consequences that had followed. One evening, while I was visiting Olivia at her apartment, she looked at me with a sad expression and said, Josh, I don't know if this is going to work. I stared at her, feeling a knot form in my stomach. What do you mean? I mean us, she said, her voice heavy with resignation. We've made such a mess of everything. I don't know if we can ever have a real relationship, especially now. It feels like we're just trying to make something work because of the baby. I didn't know how to respond. She was right, of course. We had started out as an affair, something built on lies and secrecy. Now, trying to force that into a relationship felt unnatural. "I don't want to just abandon you and the baby," I said, though I knew that didn't solve anything. "I want to be there for my child." "And you will be," Olivia said softly. "But I don't think we should try to force ourselves to be together if it's not right. It'll only make things harder for everyone." As much as I hated to admit it, I knew she was right. We had already caused enough damage, and the last thing I wanted was to create more chaos by forcing a relationship that wasn't meant to be. We agreed to co-parent, to raise our child together, but separately. I left Olivia's apartment that night feeling a sense of resignation. There was no easy fix for the mess I had created, and the reality was that I would have to learn to live with the consequences of my choices. Months passed, and slowly, life settled into a new, uncomfortable rhythm. I moved out of the motel and into a small apartment across town. It was modest, with just enough space for Dylan to stay over when he was with me. Emily and I continued to navigate our separation, but the tension between us never fully disappeared. We maintained a polite distance, exchanging cordial but brief conversations whenever I picked Dylan up or dropped him off. It was as if we were playing roles, trying to keep things as normal as possible for his sake, though we both knew that nothing would ever be the same. As for Olivia, our arrangement settled into a pattern as well. We communicated mostly about the baby, which helped keep things straightforward. She was about 6 months pregnant now, and her belly had grown noticeably rounder. I made it a point to be involved in the pregnancy, attending her checkups and discussing preparations for the baby's arrival. But there was a wall between us, an unspoken acknowledgement that what had started as a reckless affair could never become anything more. We were united by our unborn child, but we were still, in many ways, worlds apart. One day, after a particularly tense meeting with Emily about adjusting the custody schedule, I found myself lingering outside her house longer than I should have. I watched her through the window as she played with Dylan, her face lighting up with laughter as they chased each other around the living room. It was a painful reminder of the life I had thrown away. I missed her, missed the way we used to be together. But I also knew I had given her every reason not to take me back. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Olivia. It wasn't about the baby this time. "Can we talk?" she asked, and I felt a knot of anxiety form in my stomach. When I arrived at her apartment later that day, Olivia seemed nervous, pacing back and forth in the small living room. "What's going on?" I asked, sitting down on the couch, trying to keep my tone calm. She took a deep breath, then turned to face me. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she began, her voice unsteady. "About the baby, about us, and I don't think I can stay here." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, stay here? Are you planning on leaving town?" Olivia nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I need a fresh start, Josh. I can't raise this baby here, surrounded by all these reminders of how we got into this mess. My sister has offered to let me stay with her in Portland. I'd have help with the baby, and it would give me the space I need to move on." "Portland," I repeated, feeling a surge of panic. "That's over 1,000 miles away. How am I supposed to be involved in the baby's life if you're that far away?" "I know," she said, her voice cracking, "but I don't see any other choice. I'm not asking you to be okay with it, but I'm asking you to understand why I need to go." Anger and helplessness swirled inside me, but I could see the pain in her eyes, the exhaustion of trying to navigate a situation that was never supposed to be this complicated. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice steady. "If that's what you need, then I won't try to stop you," I said quietly. "But we need to work something out. I want to be a part of my child's life, Olivia." She nodded, her expression softening. "We'll figure out a way for you to visit," she promised. "And I'll bring the baby here to see you, too. But I need to do this, Josh. For me." It felt like yet another chapter of my life was closing, one that had barely begun. I wanted to argue, to convince her to stay, but what right did I have to demand that? I had already turned her life upside down. If leaving would help her rebuild, then I couldn't stand in her way. In the following weeks, Olivia made arrangements to move to Portland. We agreed that I would visit her during the last month of her pregnancy and be there for the birth, then figure out a co-parenting schedule afterward. It was far from ideal, but it was the best compromise we could manage. Meanwhile, Emily and I continued to dance around each other, still separated but not yet divorced. There were days when she seemed almost open to the idea of reconciliation. Small gestures like inviting me inside when I came to pick up Dylan, or lingering longer in conversation when we discussed his school or activities. But just when I'd start to feel hope, she would retreat again, putting up the wall that reminded me of the damage I'd caused. One evening, after dropping Dylan off at Emily's, I found myself blurting out words I hadn't planned on saying. "Emily, can we talk? I know I've said it before, but I am so sorry for everything. I want to fix things. I want to try if you're willing." She looked at me with a mixture of sadness and exhaustion, and for a moment, I thought she might say yes. But then she shook her head slowly. "Josh, it's not that simple," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "What you did, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal. And even if I wanted to forgive you, there's still a baby on the way that you're responsible for. How can I ever trust you again?" Her words cut deep, but I couldn't blame her. She was right. There was no easy fix for the mess I had created. "I understand," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I still love you, Emily. That hasn't changed." She sighed, looking away. "I know you do," she said softly. "But sometimes, love isn't enough. You shattered my trust, and it's going to take more than apologies and promises to put it back together." With that, she turned and walked back into the house, closing the door gently behind her. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily in my chest. As much as I wanted to believe that I could repair the damage, the reality was that some wounds were too deep to heal completely. The months that followed were a blur of change. Olivia moved to Portland, and I made good on my promise to visit her during the final weeks of her pregnancy. It was awkward at first, seeing her settled into a new life without me, but there was a certain peace in knowing that she was doing what was best for herself and the baby. When our daughter, Lily, was born, I felt an overwhelming sense of love and responsibility that I hadn't anticipated. She was perfect, small and fragile, with a full head of dark hair and Olivia's bright eyes. Holding her for the first time, I realized that despite all the chaos, there was something pure and beautiful that had come out of this mess. I was determined to be a good father to Lily, even if I couldn't give her the kind of family I had once imagined. I traveled to Portland as often as I could in the months that followed, arranging extended visits with Lily and helping Olivia in any way I could. Our relationship remained friendly, but there was no romantic tension between us anymore, just a mutual commitment to co-parenting and doing the best we could for our daughter. Back home, things with Emily reached a turning point. After nearly a year of separation, she filed for divorce. It wasn't an angry or bitter process. It was just a quiet acknowledgement that our marriage had run its course. We agreed to joint custody of Dylan, and while the legal proceedings were straightforward, the emotional reality was much harder to come to terms with. Signing the final paperwork felt like the closing of a door, one I had never intended to shut. As time went on, I found myself adjusting to the reality of co-parenting two children in different states. It wasn't easy, but I managed, splitting my time between Oregon and my hometown, trying to be present for both Dylan and Lily. There were moments of doubt and regret, and there were days when I missed the simplicity of my old life, before everything had spiraled out of control. But there were also moments of growth and resilience, times when I could see that despite all the mistakes I had made, I was doing my best to be a good father. Emily and I eventually found a new normal in our relationship. We were no longer husband and wife, but we were friends again, co-parents who put Dylan's needs above everything else. We spoke more openly than we had during the last years of our marriage, and there was an unspoken understanding between us. A sense that we had both moved on but still cared for each other in a different way. As for Olivia, she and I remained committed to raising Lily together, though separately. She started dating someone new, and I encouraged her to pursue her own happiness. I dated casually, but nothing ever felt quite right. Perhaps it was the lingering guilt, or the knowledge that I was still piecing myself back together. Years passed and life moved forward. I watched Dylan grow into a teenager, and Lily blossomed into a curious and bright little girl who stole my heart every time I saw her. I learned to find contentment in the life I had built, even if it wasn't the life I had planned. I would always carry the weight of my mistakes, but I had come to accept that they didn't define me entirely. I was still learning, still growing, and trying to be the best father and person I could be. Some nights, when the world was quiet and I was alone, I thought back to the choices I had made, the moments when everything had changed. I didn't know if I had truly atoned for my sins, or if I ever could. But I did know that I had faced the fallout, picked up the pieces, and was still standing. And sometimes that was enough. The years continued to slip by, and life settled into a pattern I could live with, even if it wasn't the one I had once envisioned. Dylan was growing up fast, already in high school, with a busy schedule filled with sports and friends. He had adjusted well to the shared custody arrangement, though there were times when I could sense a lingering sadness in him, a quiet acceptance of the fact that his parents would never get back together. But he was resilient, and I admired his strength more than I could ever express. Lily, now 5, was a constant source of joy and wonder. Her laughter was infectious, and every time I visited Portland, she would run to greet me with open arms, her face lighting up with pure happiness. I cherished those moments with her, knowing that I would never get this time back. The frequent flights and long drives were a small price to pay for the privilege of watching her grow up, even if it meant living with the reality of being a long-distance parent. Olivia and I had found a comfortable balance in our co-parenting relationship. She had moved on, and her relationship with her new partner seemed solid. I was genuinely happy for her, glad that she had found someone who could offer her the stability and companionship I never could. There was no animosity between us, no lingering bitterness. We were united in our love for Lily and dedicated to giving her the best life possible. As for Emily, our relationship had also evolved. The divorce had been finalized for a few years now, and while the pain of our separation had faded, there was still a quiet sadness between us, a recognition of the life we had once shared and lost. We had become friends again of a sort. We texted often about Dylan, shared updates on his schoolwork and sports events, and occasionally even went to dinner as a family, trying to keep some semblance of unity for his sake. One evening, after attending one of Dylan's basketball games, Emily and I found ourselves lingering in the parking lot. Dylan had already left with his friends, and we were the last 2 cars remaining. There was a moment of quiet between us, and then she spoke, her voice gentle. "You've changed, Josh," she said. "I can see how hard you've tried to make things right." Her words took me by surprise, and I turned to face her, my heart clenching at the sincerity in her gaze. "I'm trying," I replied quietly. "I don't know if I'll ever make up for what I did, but I'm doing my best." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I know you are, and I think we've finally found a place where we can just be okay. Not as husband and wife, but as people who shared something important." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was as close to closure as I was ever going to get. "Thank you, Emily," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "for giving me that." She gave me a small, sad smile. "You're a good dad, Josh," she said, "and that counts for a lot." We hugged then, and for the first time in years it didn't feel awkward or forced. It was just 2 people, once deeply connected, who had found a way to coexist in the aftermath of all the hurt and mistakes. There would always be a part of me that regretted how I had failed her, but there was also a part of me that had learned to accept the path my life had taken. I drove home that night feeling lighter, like a weight I had carried for years had finally begun to lift. It wasn't a complete sense of freedom, but it was enough to allow me to keep moving forward. In the end, life became a story of redemption, of slowly rebuilding and finding new purpose. I never remarried, though I did date occasionally. There were relationships that showed promise, but I had changed. I was more cautious, more aware of the need to communicate honestly and to prioritize the people who mattered to me. I couldn't afford another mistake like the one I had made with Emily and Olivia. As Dylan prepared for college, I took pride in the young man he was becoming. He was smart, kind, and driven, a far better version of me than I could have hoped for. When he left for university, it felt like a bittersweet victory, knowing that he had emerged from a broken family stronger and more resilient than I had ever been. I realized that, despite all my failures, I had done something right in raising him. Lily continued to thrive, her curious nature and bright smile a constant reminder of the unexpected beauty that could emerge from even the most complicated situations. She would always have a different story of how she came into the world, but I hoped that as she grew older, she would understand that she was loved deeply by both of her parents, no matter the circumstances of her birth. In time, I found peace with my past. I accepted that I couldn't rewrite the mistakes I had made, but I could learn from them. I could be a better father, a better friend, and someone who took responsibility for his actions. The life I had wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was mine. The years turned into decades, and I watched my children grow up and forge their own paths. Dylan became a lawyer, and Lily, with her boundless energy, pursued a career in social work. They were good people, better than I had ever hoped to be, and I couldn't have been more proud. Emily and I stayed in touch throughout our lives, our bond evolving into a quiet, respectful friendship. We grew old together in our own ways, sharing the occasional coffee or catching up on the phone. There were no lingering what-ifs between us, only a mutual understanding that we had shared a life once, and that the love we had felt for each other, despite being tested and broken, had never fully disappeared. And as for Olivia, she found her happiness in Portland, surrounded by her own family and the life she had built. We continued to co-parent Lily successfully, with her understanding that while our paths had crossed under unfortunate circumstances, we had managed to create something meaningful from the wreckage. In the end, I came to realize that life is a series of second chances. Sometimes we don't deserve them, and sometimes we don't even recognize them for what they are. But if we're lucky, we can still find a way to make things right, not by undoing the past, but by choosing to be better in the future. As I grew older, I found myself sitting on the porch of my modest house, reflecting on a life that had been far from perfect. There were regrets, yes, but there was also gratitude for the lessons I'd learned, the love I'd experienced, and the redemption I'd found in the end. I had made peace with my mistakes and had finally accepted the man I had become. Life had taught me that even the most broken things could be mended, and that sometimes, in the process of picking up the pieces, we find ourselves rebuilding something entirely new, something stronger. And that was enough.